Wozniak. So has the call been heeded? And what is next in AI's vertiginous evolution? Our panel is extremely well placed to address these questions. Do send your own through as well. There is a box on the right-hand side of your screens to do just that, and I'll make sure put those to our panel. Let me introduce them. Max Tegmark is president of the Future of Life Institute. Gaia Dempsey is the CEO at the forecasting and modeling platform Metaculus, and Stuart Russell is professor of computer science at UC Berkeley. And I can safely say you all live and breathe this stuff. Well, welcome to all of you. Max, let me kick it off with you with the letter and reactions to it. And let's start with whether we saw a pause. By all accounts, we did not. We did, though, I believe, see an uptick in regulatory activity. Do you agree we didn't see a pause? And if we didn't, has the letter been a failure?
We certainly didn't see companies immediately say, yes, we are going to pause. But I was never expecting that. What I was hoping for was instead that we would mainstream the conversation about pausing. There was a huge amount of pent-up anxiety that around the world, among experts and policymakers and others who really wanted to question whether we should just go full steam ahead with ever more powerful AI, and who didn't feel safe talking about it for fear of being mocked as scaremongering Luddites. And I feel that when the letter came out, there was like an audible sound with this pent-up pressure coming out, and the debate just exploded on the scene. We got Senate hearings, all sorts of policy activity in Europe. We got many people from across the spectrum joining the debate who had just been on the sidelines before.
Okay, is that and we'll talk about the regulation a little bit later on in the conversation. But is that enough for you to deem this a success? This letter project, or the fact that we didn't get the pause, which I assume you agree with, is that the problem for you?
Of course, we need more than conversation. We need actual safety standards put in place, which in turn will cause a pause on risky things. But getting the conversation going is already a huge step forward.
Stuart, let me ask you the same question, because we had a chat just before we came on, and I believe you might argue that we did get a pause because we didn't see anything more powerful than GPT-4 developed. Did we get the pause? Was the letter a realistic ask? And I know you signed it, and I know Gaia signed it as well.
Well, so I think had I written the letter, I would have asked for an indefinite pause, in the sense that we should define what our safety criteria are, and developers would need to show that their systems meet those criteria before they can release their system. And that's the rule we have for sandwiches, right? There's a bunch of safety rules about sandwiches, about how they're prepared, how you store the ingredients, where you get the ingredients from, how you label them. And if you don't meet all those safety criteria, you can't sell sandwiches. And so we're just asking for something similar to that. And that's an indefinite pause. It says, until you can meet this, you don't get to put systems into the market at all. And
was it realistic? Was that ask a realistic ask?
I think it's unrealistic to suppose that the letter itself would bring about a pause, but what has happened, I think, is the letter has initiated a discussion at the government level. Max mentioned some of the responses. I mean, we've had emergency meetings in the White House. The UK announced its Global AI Safety Summit, and the focus of that summit is very much on the risks that are mentioned in the letter. So I would say, from my point of view, the letter has had a much greater effect than I expected. And I used to complain about the lack of response from governments in the form of a little simulated email discussion between an alien civilization that writes to humanity and say, we're arriving soon, be prepared, be warned. And humanity responds, humanity is currently out of the office. We'll get back to you when we return. And I think the pause letter is what actually got humanity back into the office and got humanity to read the email from the aliens. And what's happened since then, I mean, the very next day, UNESCO wrote a letter, an emergency letter to all its member states saying, get on and put these rules into hard law. Stop just talking about principles. We need hard law to regulate these systems.
And as I said, we'll come into the regulation, and we'll see, and we'll ask just how realistic it is that we'll see some hard law, because I know there's a lot of talk out there, and I know we need global collaboration as well. That's something else we talk about. Gaia, what about you? Was it a wise ask, this one? And I assume I've got your platform up here, and I'm going to use it in a second because there's some fascinating AI related stuff here. I assume you didn't ask your platform to predict how likely a 6-month pause was going to be.
Regretfully, we did not pose this particular question to the Metaculus forecasting community. In terms of the success or the failure of the letter, I agree with Stuart. I think that the letter did a lot more to change the discourse than certainly than I was expecting. I think that it's really changed the tenor of the conversation, and it's changed the scope of what's possible to discuss. It sort of expanded the Overton window to include large-scale risks of AI systems that are now being taken seriously by a larger group of policymakers, and also, frankly, that has changed the discussion with the public. From my point of view, I really feel that we need a much more multidisciplinary, democratic-style discussion around the future of AI systems and how we actually want them to work in our society.
Yeah, and are you optimistic we're going to have that discussion?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that there are groups that are really getting organized now to, as Stuart and Max have pointed out, certainly at the level of policymakers and governments, and also at the level of nonprofits and the research community as well, who are really taking steps to get together and to bring to bear a more multidisciplinary approach to thinking through these issues. It's an incredibly complex set of interlocking systems that we're trying to describe, and it's a difficult system to predict.
I'll come on in a second to what exactly we're talking about here and what worries you most. But Max, I want to get back to the letter and read one sentence out. Society has hit pause on other technologies with potentially catastrophic effects on them. I assume here you're talking about previous bans on human cloning, on gene editing. My question to you, Max, though, is: do they actually help, these bans, or do they just push development into the shadows? And that's what we'll see in this case.
I think the examples you mentioned are great examples of where it has helped. There was you could make a lot of money on human cloning, and try to create millions of people who look exactly like Gaia and whatever. And no shade on you, Gaia, but there was a lot of discussion in the early 70s about whether we should do this, and the consensus was this is just too risky. We might just lose control over our human species if we start messing with our germline like that. And we chose to not go forward with this technology, even that you could have made a lot of money on. People today often say, oh, but China or whatever, China has in fact also decided on its own that they don't want human cloning. They even put a guy in jail for working on it recently. So in exactly the same way, if we build ever more powerful AI systems, so-called artificial general intelligence, which can do almost all jobs better than humans and lead to super intelligence, it's very likely that, like Alan Turing warned us about in 1951, we will just lose control over the future of our species, over the future of the planet. And this is not something the Chinese government wants. They like to be in control. It's not something any Western governments want either. It's not something the public wants either. There was a remarkable poll that just came out this week saying that more than 2/3 of Americans want to regulate AI and slow things down, even if it means that China catches up with the US. Not
yeah.
losing control over our destiny is a very important thing that I think where politicians just need to get on board with a majority and regulate the companies, listen to people, not lobbyists.
Stuart, Max mentioned AGI, artificial general intelligence. We talk about the singularity. I heard you say recently that that we're a long way off that. We're a long way off having to worry about that. I think Metaculus calls it for 2032. I think you're one of your predictions for AGI, Gaia. Is there a lot of scaremongering here? How far off are we, Stuart? Let me start with you.
Well, so I certainly never said we're a long way off from having to worry. We should have been worrying, and we should be worrying, because what matters is how long is it going to take to achieve the kind of AI that Turing warned would take control, versus how long is it going to take to figure out how to make AI of that level guaranteed, safe, and beneficial for humanity. So it's a race, and we should be worried that we're losing that race. And I think, to be honest, even though I've been working on the second part of that race for nearly a decade, I feel like we're losing that race, because AI capabilities have dramatically advanced in the last few years. And I would say most people's timeline for when AGI arrives, which is not a particularly well-defined thing, but let's go with it. Most people's timelines have shrunk by at least a factor of 2. So people who thought it was 30 years now think it's 15 years. People who thought it was 20 some of them now think it's 5.
Okay, and you've said before this would be the biggest event in human history. AI taking over the world is language we hear often. Gaia, your Metaculus says, I think I was right in saying mid-January 2032, AGI, 91% chance of human intelligence parity by 2040. But you forecast a 50% chance, this is interesting, of a positive transition to a post-AGI world. What does that mean?
So when we're looking at sort of different possible future scenarios, there's the regulatory landscape, there's the technology landscape, there's self-improvement capabilities. There's the effect on the economy, on labor, on our social systems. On the negative side, there's also things like, the ability to use AI systems to commit terrorist attacks and these sorts of things. So there's kind of a broad set of possibilities, and the question of do we transition to a good future is really the question of what is the balance of these different future states. Are we increasing our defensive capabilities to the same degree as we are increasing our potential offensive capabilities? So I think that our most important forecast is probably this one about the timing of artificial general intelligence. And we do have a definition there. It's hard to kind of it's hard to get a broad section of people to all agree on how to define AGI, but we've done our best to sort of look at a range of different capabilities, from reasoning and agency and being able to achieve goals over periods of time, and having robotic capabilities, sort of these multimodal capabilities. So since the release of GPT-4, that particular forecast has decreased, and our timeline has shortened by about 6 to 7 years. It was hovering around 2038, and now it's around 2031, 2032, as you're saying. So it's I think it's very much this sort of race dynamic that Stuart is talking about, in terms of, are we investing in the capabilities to ensure that we can provably deploy systems that are safe, and that's what's needed to ensure that safe transition. Otherwise, we're running a risk, and 50% is, if you're thinking about risk mitigation, if there's a 1 in 2 chance that something this serious and this consequential is not going to go well, then that's a really serious warning call that we should be heeding.
Max, back to the letter. I mean, it did spark, quite a lot of controversy. There was a bit of a backlash. AI getting Hollywood level attention, other important non-existential threats being overlooked. I mean, I guess the very AGI on one side, but the very real worries that we're experiencing now are the disinformation, the defamation, deepfake technology, data security, job security. I mean, these are things that regulators, I imagine, can get their teeth into right now.
So saying that we should not worry about things like human extinction or human disempowerment in 2032 or beyond just because of terrible harms that are happening right now is exactly like saying, oh, we shouldn't worry about global climate change because of the floods in Libya. It's ridiculous to say things like that, given that the floods in Libya or the present harms of AI are, of course, just the first indicators of this broad trend towards disempowerment that's happening. We should focus on both. And moreover, corporate lobbyists who were behind part of the backlash, obviously, against the letter, because they didn't like to be regulated, they love any opportunities they have to sort of divide those who are trying to rein in big tech. That's no different from how big tobacco and the fossil fuel industry tried to divide attempts to rein them in. And I want to emphasize, I love what Gaia and her team have done with Metaculus, because it really quantifies a radical change that we're seeing. There was another definition of artificial general intelligence also, the one you call weak AGI, where it's now pegged at 2026. And there's also a bet on Metaculus on how long it'll take from getting to human level artificial general intelligence to super intelligence, this almost godlike AI. And last time I checked, that was less than 1 year. So once you have one mind that's sort of human level, well, it's pretty easy to make 1,000 or 1,000,000 of them and to run them faster and to use that to drive your AI research. So what this means is that the superior alien civilization, a new species basically that can take control over our planet, that Stuart was warning about, might actually come within a year or so of when we get to AGI. And we will have built it ourselves. So when you saw two months after our letter came out, this other statement warning of human extinction from AI, which was signed even by the CEOs that are actually leading the charge to build AGI, Sam Altman of OpenAI and Demis Hassabis of DeepMind. I really commend them for having the courage to sign that, to warn about their own tech. That's what they were really scared of. Not AGI, but what comes shortly thereafter.
Okay, look, at the start, you talked about Senate hearings, meetings at the Capitol, about the EU's AI Act, the AI Safety Summit in the UK that's going to happen in Bletchley, I believe, in November. The letter it shook things up. It legitimized discussion, really, of a lot of these things. Which a lot of people clearly applaud. Stuart, let me kick this off with you. What do you want to see from this UK AI Safety Summit? Do you believe that it can garner enough attention, that it can generate enough global collaboration to deal with these issues that Max says are going to happen within a year?
So what I would like to see from it, three things. One, agreement on an international regulatory body and process to coordinate national regulators who are developing specific hard law. Two, some type of international research collaboration on AI safety, because I think just as with climate change, this is in everybody's interest. No one has an interest in another country creating unsafe AI systems that go out of control.
Or in their own country doing it.
or their own country,
Right.
for that matter. And then the third thing actually is agreement on what are the first set of hard law regulations going to be. And I think some things are pretty easy to agree on. For example, a ban on the impersonation of human beings, that we have a fundamental right to know if we're interacting with an AI system or a real human being. So that would be a fairly easy one, and we're pushing on an open door. But I think what we really want are red lines. Behaviors that the developers must demonstrate that their systems will never exhibit. And if they do exhibit it in the field, then the systems are automatically removed from the market. They have to be terminated. Okay. So that means the developers also have to have a way of terminating their systems and every copy of their systems that exists.
All right, let me pick you up on that, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here, and I'm picking this up because there are a number of questions from our audience that want to talk about this. Taking into account the incredibly perilous geopolitical context right now, and as you can imagine, at Reuters, this is something we keep an extremely close eye on. Can you really imagine anyone, in fact, Gaia, let me start with you. Can you really imagine one side, say China or the US, reining themselves in? Surely this is going to be a global arms race.
I think, Axel, that you're right about the challenge of a company, or at this point maybe even a nation, sort of self-regulating, because the incentives are incredibly strong to create systems that you can delegate more and more tasks to. And by doing so, you can, stringing together a set of capabilities, you can increase productivity, and you can increase wealth. And so there's an incredibly strong incentive that is driving investment at the level of both the investment community and also at the level of nations. So I think that's the headwind that this conversation about AI safety is going to need to exist in.
Yeah.
And it is really the task of I believe the AI safety community and the AI research community to articulate clearly enough what the risks are and what the potential solutions are, and what type of oversight is really feasible and functional in such a way that this can be overcome. Because we've seen, as we have seen cases, Max brought up, bioengineering, gene splicing, where there are technologies that we just simply weren't willing to accept as a global society. And I think that with AI, it's a little bit more complex than some of those previous examples, because the benefits are so great as well. And so it's a multiple uses that really are beneficial for humanity. And so this is a time of needing to navigate very carefully in such a ways that we can capture those benefits and mitigate the risks.
Yeah, and look, the last thing I want to be is the doom monger here, but Stuart talks about red lines, and I look at G20 meetings, and I look at now compared to say 20 years ago, and it just seems to me rather an unrealistic proposition. I know, Max, you call on Rishi Sunak and the Bletchley meeting to make some headway in terms of global cooperation and collaboration here. What do you feel optimistic about that? What specifically are you saying to them?
I'll try to inject some optimism here, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Because you asked why would a country rein in their own AI industry. China actually has already reined in its own AI industry this year, more than the European Union has, but they're also doing it a bit with the EU AI Act. The US is last in this. Why did the Chinese government do that? Was it to be nice to the Americans? Absolutely not. It's because the Chinese Communist Party really does not want to lose control to some super powerful AI coming out of a Chinese AI company, right? And why did America and Great Britain and China all rein in their biotech industry by having a regulatory agency like the US FDA, even though you might think that way they could get outcompeted in biotech by other countries. Same reason. It wasn't in their egoistic national advantage to have massive numbers of people dying from poisonous medicines or anything like that, right? So there's a lot of precedent here. This is not something particularly new. Stuart mentioned the example of sandwiches. For those of you who aren't so familiar with sandwich regulations, it's good to remember that this is actually the default. This is the way it works in every industry where you have powerful tech. People have reined in their car companies with seatbelt laws and airbag laws. They've reined in their airplane companies by having all sorts of safety rules. They've reined in their nuclear civilian industry with laws on nuclear reactors. And in hindsight, they wish they had done even better after Fukushima and things like this. So the question isn't whether eventually countries will rein in their AI industry out of a selfish national interest. Question is just, can they do it fast enough? Because unfortunately, and this is why we called for the pause, technology has been progressing much faster than governance in this space. And we need people, we need a little bit of a pause to let the governance catch up and formulate those safety standards that Stuart was asking for.
Yeah, okay, Stuart, I can see you want to come in here.
Yeah, I just think the entire narrative that you can have safety or you can have benefits and you can't have both is completely wrong. You can have benefits only if you have safety. And we can see the nuclear industry as a perfect example of that. There were some corners cut on safety, and the nuclear industry itself was destroyed. It wasn't just that we lost all that cheap electricity and we generated a ton more carbon dioxide. The industry destroyed itself because of the lack of safety. And so they didn't deliver any benefits because literally after Chernobyl, they stopped existing. And obviously the tech companies should understand that the same thing could happen to them. If there is a Chernobyl scale mishap with AI, and some people in fact argue that social media are already a Chernobyl scale mishap, then there could be very serious consequences for their industry. And I think it's very telling, as Max pointed out. So not just that 2/3 of Americans are opposed to developing super intelligent AI, but the fact that 80% of Americans have a clear opinion. And of those 80%, it's 4-1 in favor of not having super intelligent AI and being willing to forego the benefits.
I'm not distracted here, but I'm just looking at the regulation of AI bit on the Metaculus platform, and there's some fascinating bits here as well. Will OpenAI's ChatGPT be generally available to the European Union? June 30th, 24, 92% say yes. US requiring purchasers of large numbers of GPUs to report their usage before 2026, 10%. So it goes like that. Gaia, what can the corporations expect in the US? What's it going to look like, regulation in the US? And how gradual do you think it's going to be as policymakers try and get their head around? I want to talk about how, to the extent to which you all think AI researchers should be working very closely with policymakers on this. Go ahead, Gaia.
We're going to be releasing a set of forecasts in the near future that are really focused on this exact question around the timing and the sort of nature of various AI policy initiatives in the US. So I'm going to hold off on saying too much until that's out. But generally, I do think that it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of, there are things that are moving forward. Chuck Schumer has been very active in the conversation and pushing things forward. But there's also, people dragging their feet and really sort of focusing the conversation around innovation. I think it's really true what Stuart is saying that it's not an either or. It's not that you can, not develop AI at all, and therefore avoid the risks, and therefore, also avoid all of the benefits. But I think that, in our policy conversations, it often lacks some of that nuance, and messages don't get necessarily heard in full. And so I think that there's work to do to really bring more nuance to the discussion and really bring some more technical detail and understanding to the discussion. I think that's really the work that we need to do in terms of building bridges between the technical AI safety and research communities and policymakers and their staff, so that they can really understand this. One of my favorite sayings is, not the devil is in the details, but God is in the details. We really need to figure this out at the level of things like the ability to code, the ability of systems to improve their own code, the ability to automate research, the ability to automate manufacturing tasks, decision making. There's concerns about entire organizations in the future being run by AI systems. There's a lot of debates that need to happen. Again, I'm going to be kind of hone in on this a lot. I really think that it needs to be a much more multidisciplinary discussion with AI researchers and with experts in these other fields, so that we can actually understand better what's feasible, what are real risks, and what should we do about them.
And a question comes in: what's your assessment of the voluntary commitments made by AI developers? That White House announcement in July. What do you make of that?
I would say those and $2 will get you a cup of coffee.
Right.
My feeling is
thank you, Stuart.
In the AI community in the United States, there is quite a lot of genuine commitment to doing things the right way. I think that there's a lot of common ground, but the rubber needs to meet the road in terms of what does that look like on the level of, as Stuart calls them, hard regulations. What is that actually going to turn into at the end of the day?
I agree with both Stuart and Gaia on this one. On one hand, it's clear from talking to the CEOs of these companies and so many of the people who work in them, that these are generally good, well-meaning people. And I really want to express gratitude to the leaders of these companies for speaking out on the risks of what they're building. We haven't seen experts warning about their own technology like this since the days of Oppenheimer. And yet, it's also really obvious that none of these companies can pause alone, which is why voluntary talk of voluntary self-regulation is just as ridiculous as if the tobacco industry promised to self-regulate. Because even if there is a CEO of a tobacco company who, for some reason, wakes up one morning and decides, we should stop making cigarettes, he or she can't. They'll just get replaced by another CEO, by the shareholders. There's such a strong commercial pressure here. And I view the fact that the leaders from these companies are making these warnings and even signed the statement warning of extinction as actually a cry for help from these leaders, where they're saying, come in and regulate us because we can't stop ourselves.
Okay. Some people, Max, would say you're giving them the benefit of the doubt here. That's not the right excuse. Every CEO says to you, look, we really want to do this, but we can't do it on our own. We're going to wait till the next guy does it, or the next guy does it. It's not the response you want to hear.
The conclusion is the same. You do need governments to step in and put laws in place, right? And
what about the EU AI Act? Which is pretty comprehensive. It seems to me it's going to come into law quite soon. Does that offer an adequate model to regulators around the world? Max, first, let's start with you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's great as a first step in the right direction. I very much applaud it. I wish the Americans had come. We here in America had come as far with an American AI Act as the Europeans have, but it's obviously not enough. First of all, it shows the enormous power of the tech lobbyists here, because the original version of the EU AI Act had a little loophole in it, little footnote basically saying that it doesn't apply to ChatGPT and systems like that. And I actually worked very hard with my colleagues in the Future Life Institute to call that out and get that loophole removed. I'm happy that it's removed in the current text. I hope it stays out in the final sausage making that's taking place now. But it's not enough. We need red lines, like Stuart Russell said, just like we have in biotech, for example, where the onus is really on the companies to show that their products are safe and that the benefits outweigh the risks. If a biotech company comes to the regulator and says, we couldn't be bothered doing a clinical trial because it's so expensive, and and China, they're just going to be laughed out of the room and come back when they've done their homework. And that's how it has to become in AI also, where companies are incentivized to spend the money themselves on the safety research so they can convince experts that it is safe, and then they can release these powerful products.
Go ahead, Stuart.
I think Max is right. There is no, I think, successful example of voluntary self-regulation actually having the intended effect. And for the obvious reasons of commercial imperative. And Microsoft, in fact, back before they invested in OpenAI, were quite vocal about this. They basically said, look, there's a race to the bottom. Either you regulate us or we are forced to be evil. And I can remember Brad Smith saying it in more or less in those words. And they've backpedaled a little bit since they've become a big investor in OpenAI. But I think the principle is still correct. And I actually see some hope here, because from a political point of view, it's kind of obvious. Politicians wet their finger and put it in the wind, and they sense which way is the wind blowing, and they see, okay, I could be on the side of humanity, or I can be on the side of out of control AI systems that are going to take everyone's jobs, blah blah blah, right? Whatever narrative you want. And I think for most politicians, it's pretty obvious which side they should be on. But don't underestimate the power of the tech lobbies. As Max gave us one example where literally they put in a clause saying, for the purposes of this act, general purpose AI shall not be considered AI. It's like, what? How could you do that? But that's what was in. And then we have
defamation, deepfake technology, etc., that can be addressed quite effectively today. How well, Gaia? Let me throw this at you. How seriously are those being looked at? Disinformation, of course, misinformation, fact checking, huge part of our DNA here at Reuters, for example. Huge issue ahead of the elections in the US next year and elsewhere. How effectively are they being looked at now, do you think?
I think it's a really good question. I think that there's a technical question and there's a legal question. I think that the legal question is now being looked at a bit more carefully because of things like the writer's strike that's happening in Los Angeles, where there's there's a sort of rebellion from the creative industry that's saying, these systems are going to, literally change the value of human creativity. And that's sort of just even looking at, the sort of harmless effects of generative AI systems. I think, and we've already seen examples where, on the basis of voice samples, AI systems can call a parent and simulate the voice of their child and say, you've been kidnapped, or say that, I've been kidnapped and I need to be paid a ransom. And so there's some attention I think that's being paid there. I think on the technical level, there's questions around, how can imagery be cryptographically stamped or secured in such a way that, it can be traced and its origin can be validated. And I think that's a really tricky problem and one that it's unclear how that will scale broadly, and I think more research is needed.
Okay, let me throw a few of these questions and comments from the audience out at you. Some interesting ones here. One could argue that US AI giants want regulation to raise the bar and make it difficult for new entrants or foreign rivals. Would you agree with that, Stuart?
No, I wouldn't. I've heard this argument a lot. And just to go back to sandwiches, right? There's far more stringent regulations on opening a sandwich shop. You need multiple permits from multiple authorities. You need to train every one of your employees and have them pass state-mandated licensing standards. So in some jurisdictions, it's more than a dozen permits have to be obtained, and yet we manage to open hundreds of thousands of restaurants every year. So I just think this is just not realistic.
I'm glad, Stuart. Yeah, I'm glad you came back to sandwiches, because another one comes in that says, they like the sandwich metaphor, but sandwiches are now choosing their own fillings, aren't they? And that's the problem.
Well, I mean, yes, obviously the AI systems are have much greater potential than sandwiches to cause harm, and I think this is often a misunderstanding about what we mean by AI safety. About an accident happening to one person, for example, a self-driving car crashing or a sandwich giving somebody food poisoning. But when you have this sort of systemic scale, which happens more, for example, with pharmaceuticals, where, for example, with fen-phen, we're talking about 50 to 100,000 people who probably suffered serious heart damage from that. If you go back in history, there was one pharmaceutical that probably paralyzed 400,000 people in the US before people figured out what was going on. So those are things on a more societal scale, and AI would be on a still greater scale. And so, and because of its ability, as the questioner pointed out, to change its own filling, right, to become even different from the object that the regulators evaluated, makes it that much more challenging. So one interesting thing that's going on actually is in the definition of AI itself. So I've been working with the OECD, which sort of is the granddaddy of definitions, which then went to the US, went to the EU, and the definition that they developed was initially wrong in some important ways. For example, it requires that there be given human-defined objectives. And lo and behold, ChatGPT does not have given human-defined objectives. So it's excluded from the definition of AI system. And I think that was entirely inadvertent. But now there's a lot of governments who want to insist that it's only an AI system if it learns after deployment. That also rules out ChatGPT, because ChatGPT is not continually learning. We in fact discovered when we put the Tay-bot out, Microsoft's Tay-bot, that if it learns after deployment, it can be absolutely disastrous, because Tay went from a perfect chatbot to a raving neo-fascist within 2 days. And so the vast majority of AI systems do not learn after deployment. And according to these governments, they are not AI systems at all. And that just shows this sort of disconnect that governments lack an understanding of what AI is and how it works and what it does. And mainly that's because they lack the expertise within the policymaking apparatus. And that's one of the changes that's underway right now. There's going to be a Europe-wide AI office. There's probably going to be a US national AI office, and hopefully in the UK too.
Okay, look, one more before I ask you for some closing thoughts, and I do want to come back to the letter. But first, do you worry that a pause could cause a massive jump in capabilities once lifted because of increases in computing power during that intervening period? I mean, is that a fair assumption?
I feel this is another one of those arguments that was probably crafted by some tech lobbyists as an excuse to why they don't want the pause. I mean, you could say the same about biotech. Isn't it terrible that you have to have clinical trials, because then once you lift all the safety standards, isn't there going to be like a jump in dangerous medicines? We're never going to lift the safety standards. That's the whole point of having the safety standards. When Stuart says a red line, it means it's going to stay there.
What do you think, Guy?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a strange question. I think it sort of misconceives the idea of what the pause is for, right? It's exactly saying, well, we'll pause and then we'll continue as we were before, which is not really the intent of the pause. And I also just want to sort of push back on the framing of the pause, because I don't even think that the Future of Life Institute itself is really advocating for a pause today, right? There's actually very specific policy proposals that they've put out that they're hoping to push forward in terms of, you know, an agenda around AI regulation. And I think that that should be the focus, right? And the focus is creating the right regulations as quickly as possible, independent of, you know, whether a pause happened or how fast or how long a pause was.
Yeah, again, fair point. In hindsight, Max, would you have written this thing differently?
No, it's important to clarify what this called for, right? We called for there to be safety standards, red lines, just like in biotech and other fields. And, you know, the safety standards themselves, of course, cause a pause. Having the requirement of clinical trials for medicines means that the development of any new medicine pauses until they've met the safety standards, right? So we caused the pause by having the safety standards. It didn't say 6 months. It said things have to be paused until they meet the safety standards. We just put in the 6 months there because we needed a little bit of a breather for formulating safety standards.
Final question to all of you, and again, it comes back to the letter, and you know, 6 months ago compared to now. Are you, Gaia, start with you. Are you more or less concerned 6 months on about where we are? You know, taking into account the sort of reaction we saw from industry or lack of it, but taking into account the uptick in regulatory activity and what we might see there, and taking into account the fact that everyone's talking about this now. You know, you're doing shows like this with news organizations like Reuters. I mean, what more or less concerned, Gaia, would you say?
I want to just take a second to give some credit to OpenAI specifically for actually doing 6 months of testing before releasing GPT-4 and actually outsourcing that to a third party, an independent nonprofit. So there are signals like that make me, you know, that sort of update me toward feeling optimistic that, you know, this is being taken seriously. Companies are taking it seriously, even in the absence of that sort of being regulated externally. I think that, you know, the conversation needs to now move into, you know, a dialogue that's stronger and more around, you know, what the regulation should be across labs and governments. So I would say I'm not necessarily more concerned than I was 6 months ago. I would say I'm sort of, you know, the speed at which AI progress is moving is really, it's accelerating. And so I would say that, like, there's some things that have made me more concerned, and then there's some things that made me more optimistic, and they've kind of washed each other out.
All right, Stuart, same to you.
So I think what Gaia says is right. There has been really quite dramatic progress, not so much in just scaling up the large language models, but actually finding ways to couple them into larger, more complex types of systems that are able to plan, systems that are able to interact with the world through email, or even through, you know, buying things with a credit card, coupling them together into committees and so on. So everyone is trying to figure out how to take this somewhat mysterious but very powerful ingredient and then come up with recipes for much more capable AI systems that sort of plug the various gaps that the language models themselves don't fill. And so there's on the regulatory side, I think both the general response and the bipartisan nature of that response make me much more optimistic than I was. And I'm quite encouraged that governments are taking this seriously. And, you know, even though, you know, November 1st is when the UK AI Summit is happening, which is quite soon, there's intense amounts of work happening to try to ensure that there's a real agreement.
And it seems to me, Max, that's where you're drawing your optimism as well. The fact that conversation is really happening, the fact that the regulators are moving very much in the right direction. You know, whether you think it's a good thing that CEOs say, yes, we want to do this, but we can't, is another thing. But what are your final thoughts?
Exactly. I think there's good news and there's bad news. I agree with your summary of the good news there. The conversation is finally happening about the really biggest questions. And there is finally a lot of activity happening in the governance space. That's really great. On the flip side, we're seeing a lot of signs of regulatory capture and it's really important that Reuters and other news agencies ask tough questions to politicians when they have hearings and meetings where they only invite CEOs from tech companies. It's like if you had a lung cancer meeting and you only invited CEOs of tobacco companies to advise you how to write the laws, right? Got to push back against that. There's also warning signs of tech lobbyists trying to divide and conquer, again, by getting those who want to rein in tech to squabble about whether they should worry about disinformation or worried about loss of control of more powerful systems. And finally, there is the concern that we're going to derail the progress towards reining in big tech with good regulations by getting into some sort of geopolitical pissing contest. I really want to applaud the British for coming out clearly and announcing now that, yes, they are inviting China to the summit. That's the way to do it. Play to the egoistic self-interests of all countries to use AI for all the wonderful economic benefits it can have and to not lose control over it.
Yeah, very good. All right. Look, we've gone over time, but there were plenty of things we didn't talk about that we will talk about, by the way, when we pick this conversation up during the Reuters NEXT event on the 8th and 9th of November in New York. I know some of you are going to be there in person. Some of you are going to join remotely. We'll have the policymakers there as well, Max. So we'll speak to policy, we'll speak to business, and we'll speak to the ethics folk. Hopefully we'll have all the voices there then. Gaia, Max and Stuart, many thanks for your time. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. That's it for now. I'm Axel Threlfall for Reuters.
Thank you.